One might argue that if the 10 men had simply done their duty and chosen her, Alira would never have said the thing that made an entire hall forget how to breathe. But then again, if any single one of those 10 had owned a spine worth the name, he'd not have needed a second glance to know exactly what she was worth. So really, when a person thought it through with any honesty at all, the whole disaster was their fault, every last splinter of it. The choosing was held each autumn in the great hall of Ashmark Keep, under a ceiling so high, the torch smoke lost itself in the dark before it ever found the rafters. The unbonded stood along the western wall in a long, patient row, scrubbed and stiff in their good clothes, and the eligible men walked the line like buyers at a horse fair, and everyone pretended it was something holier than that. A male stopped before the woman he wanted, spoke her name, and offered his open hand. She took it, or the right allowed her to refuse, though refusing was a thing girls whispered about, and almost never did. It was, when you stripped the incense and the old songs away, a market. Alira had known that since she was 14, she had simply never before been the goods left unsold. She stood 11th in the line, which she would come to think of as a joke the gods had set up years in advance. The first man chose a weaver's daughter, with a laugh like a bell. The second and third took sisters from a river holding, and the hall murmured its approval. The fourth walked the whole length of the row with his chin up, and Alira felt her heart do something stupid and hopeful when his eyes brushed hers. And then his eyes kept going, the way eyes had been sliding off her since she was a child, and he chose the girl to her left. So did the fifth, who at least had the grace to look apologetic about reaching past her to do it. The sixth did not look at her at all. The seventh looked too long, then turned away with his mouth pressed thin, as though she'd asked him something rude. By the eighth, the hall had begun to understand what it was watching, and a hall of wolves is never quiet about what it understands. She heard it start the low, pitying rustle, the small, cruel hum of 100 people, grateful it was not their turn to stand where she stood. She kept her eyes on the far wall and her spine straight as a spear, because Halvard had taught her that a warden does not flinch, and she was, whatever else the night decided she was, a warden of the Reach, the best tracker on the northern border, and she would not give them the gift of watching her fold. The ninth man reached her, and paused, and she felt the whole room lean. He was looking at her eyes. They always looked at her eyes in the end. One of them was ordinary, dark as wet bark. The other was the pale gray blue of river ice in the deep of winter, and it had been that color since the year the long cold came down off the mountains and took her birth pack in the night. All of them, every aunt and cousin and both her parents, and left one frost-burned child breathing in the snow come morning. Frost-marked, the old wives called it, death's leftover. A woman death had already put its hand on once, and would surely come back to finish, and no wise man wanted to be standing beside her when it did. The ninth man chose someone else. Then the 10th. And the 10th was the one who could not simply pass, who had to make a performance of it, pausing before her with a curl to his lip. "I'd sooner bet a grave," he said, not quite under his breath, and the men near him laughed, and that laugh was the thing that broke something loose in Alira's chest that had been lashed down tight for 11 years. She should have kept her eyes on the wall. She had a whole life's practice at keeping her eyes on the wall. She lifted her chin instead. "You," she said, and her voice carried further than she meant it to, out over the tables and up toward the dais where the crown sat and watched. "All 10 of you. You crossed a frozen hall to reach past the one woman here who's put her body between your borders and things that would have eaten your children. And you did it because a girl with a pale eye frightens you more than the dark does." She was distantly aware that she had stopped being able to stop. "I have run the Reach alone through nights that would have done manned every soul in this room. I do not need your open hands. I would sooner run it gray and alone than be warmed by any coward here, and that includes the throne, which sits up there so far above the choosing. It hasn't the stomach to come down and stand in a market it's happy enough to hold. The incense hissed in its bowls. Somewhere a bench scraped and went still. It is worth saying, for those who have never done such a thing, that there is a particular silence that comes only after you have insulted a king in his own hall, and it does not sound like other silences. It sounds like the inside of a drum the instant before it struck. On the dais, the Iron King rose. Alira had seen King Corvain exactly twice in her life, both times from a distance measured in bowshots, and both times he had been doing the thing he was best known for, which was standing very still, while men who had crossed him were made to understand the cost of it. He did not shout. She had heard he had not raised his voice in the 9 years since he broken the old Alpha lines and taken Valemore for his own, one severed loyalty at a time, and that this was somehow worse than shouting. He was tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, dark-haired, plain-faced in a way. The portraits flattered and failed at once, and his eyes when they found her across the length of the hall were the flat, patient gray of a wolf that has already decided and is only waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. He came down off the dais. He came down the whole length of that hall, unhurried, while every wolf in it dropped its gaze, and he did not stop until he stood close enough that she had to tip her chin to hold his eyes. Which she did because she had already thrown her life away, and there seemed little sense in throwing away her spine on top of it, frost-marked, he said. His voice was low and even, and entirely without heat. Ill luck. Death's leftover. He said the words the way a man turns coins over testing them. That is what they call you. Yes, she said. And 10 men just refused you rather than stand beside what death has touched. Her jaw ached from holding it. Yes. Something moved behind the flat gray of his eyes. She would spend a great many later nights trying to name it. And failing. He turned his head slow and looked down the row of 10 men who had chosen, and then back at the one woman they hadn't. And when he spoke again, he pitched it to Carrie, to every corner of the hall. How fortunate for me, said the Iron King, that I have never once in my life been afraid of dying. The hall made a sound like a wave, pulling back off shingle. Lyra looked at that open hand, at the scar across the knuckles, at the ring that every wolf in Valemore had knelt to, and she understood with a lurch of pure vertigo that whatever happened next, the girl who had stood 11th in the line was already gone, and she had killed her herself, with her own mouth, in front of the entire court. Lyra woke the next morning to the conviction that she had made the single largest mistake it was possible for a living person to make, and to the smell of senna burning the tea. For one merciful breath, she did not remember. She lay in her narrow warden's bunk with the gray dawn coming through the arrow slit, and thought only that her mouth was dry and her head hurt, the way it does after a night the body would rather forget. Then the night came back, not in pieces, but all at once, whole and merciless, the way the worst things do. The line, the laughing, her own flat voice carrying up to the dais, and the hand, the open hand between them, and her own hand rising to meet it because the right left her nothing else to do, and the cold dry press of the Iron King's fingers closing over hers, while a hall full of people watched her be chosen the way you watch a stone drop down a well. There she is, said Senna, from the doorway. Valemore's blushing bride, Lyra said, into her pillow. Oh, we're well past don't. Senna came in and set a cup down by the bunk with a click. Senna was small and sharp and had been Lyra's friend since they were both 12, and undersized, and made to share the bottom of everyone's estimation. And she wore worry the way she wore everything, disguised as scorn. Tobin's been sick twice already. He heard it from the kitchen before the torches were even out. Half the reach thinks you'll be dead by the new moon, and the other half thinks that's optimistic, Lyra sat up. He chose me, in front of everyone. That isn't a death sentence. It's, she stopped, because she did not actually have a word for what it was. Isn't it? Senna's voice dropped, and the scorn fell out of it. And what was left underneath was the thing that scared Elira more than anything the 10th man had said. Think about who chose you. That man doesn't want things. 9 years and he's never taken a mate, never taken a woman anyone could name, never done a single soft thing in the sight of a witness. Men like that don't reach out an open hand at a choosing because a girl caught their eye across the room. She sat down heavily on the end of the bunk. He did it for something. And you don't know what. And that's the part that should be turning your stomach. It was, as it happened, turning her stomach. But there is a particular stubbornness that grows in a person who has spent the better part of her life being told she is bad luck, and it is the stubbornness of someone who has learned that if she flinches at every dark shape, she will spend her whole life flinching. Elira said, "It's the only thing I'm any good at finding out what." The door banged. Tubin filled it pink and breathless, 17 and built like a young ox, and currently the color of old cheese. "The huntmaster wants you," he said now. He said now 3 times. Elira's stomach, which had been merely turning, dropped clean out of her, because Halvard did not say now 3 times. Halvard was the calmest man in Valemore, a slab of gray-bearded patience, who had pulled her out of a snowbank at 13, when the fostering families were all quietly agreeing that the frost-marked girl was more trouble than a spare mouth was worth. He had put a tracking knife in her hand and told her that death having touched her once only meant death, already knew it couldn't keep her, and she had loved him for it with the whole fierce loyalty of a child no one else would claim. Halvard did not panic. If Halvard was saying now 3 times, the world had come off its hinges. She dressed. She went. She spent the whole cold walk down through the keep, telling herself it might not be so bad, and failing to believe a word of it, the way you fail to believe your own comfort, at 3 in the morning. Halvard was standing when she came in, not sitting, which was wrong. One big hand flat on the map table, as if he needed it to hold himself up. He looked at her, and his weathered face did something she had never once seen it do in 11 years. It went afraid. "Tell me it's a rumor," he said. "Tell me the whole keep has it wrong, and you did not stand up in the choosing and put a blade in the king's pride in front of the entire court." And he did not answer it by claiming you, where every soul alive could see. There was nothing to tell him that they both didn't already know. Halvard, gods? He dragged his hand down his face. "Do you understand what you've done? A king can forgive a great many things in the dark. He cannot forgive a single one of them, in front of witnesses. You made him choose, girl. In front of 10 men who just refused you in a hall that was laughing. You made the Iron King choose between looking weak and picking up death's leftover. And he is not a man who has ever once chosen to look weak." He shook his head slowly. "We need to start thinking about how to keep you breathing." Elira had faced down a great many frightening things. In the dark of the Reach, she had never once been frightened by the sight of Halvard afraid, and she found she did not care for it at all. He didn't seem angry, she tried. It sounded thin even as she said it. "He's the king," Halvard said. "He doesn't need to be angry. Anger is for men who can't simply have the thing done." He straightened, and she watched him pull the calm back on. Over the fear like a man shrugging into a wet coat. "Listen to me. Whatever he wants from you, you give it, and you keep your head down, and you say yes. Your Majesty, until I've had time to." The bell over the keep's inner gate began to ring. Halvard's head came up. Elira had heard that bell perhaps 4 times in her life, and every time it had meant one thing, that someone had come up through the whole fortress, past every ward and every gate, without a single guard daring to stop him. They heard it under the second toll. Not the tramp of a detail come to make an arrest. One man's tread, unhurried, easy, coming down the stone corridor toward the huntmaster's door. Halvard stopped breathing. Elira watched the same impossible arithmetic reach him in the same instant it reached her. The king had not sent for her. The king had come himself. The door opened without a knock. because the man who opened it had never in 9 years needed to knock on anything, and King Corvain walked into the low gray room, and the room rearranged itself around him the way iron filings turn to face a lodestone. Elira felt it in her own skin before she'd fully turned the pressure of a true alpha, the old animal part of her, going still and low and attentive under her ribs. Whether she willed it or not, she'd known he was the king. But some cowardly part of her had spent the night trying to shrink him back down to a man she'd merely been rude to. This morning, let her keep none of it. He filled the doorway and then the room, dark and unhurried, and the certainty came off him like cold off a stone. The certainty of a wolf who had not had to raise his voice to be obeyed. In so long he had likely forgotten how. "Huntmaster," he said without looking away from Elira. "Leave us." Halvard, who had stared down a border war without blinking, bowed. "Majesty, if there's discipline owed for last night, let it be mine too." "There is no discipline owed." The king's flat gray eyes had not moved from her face. "A man cannot be insulted by his own betrothed. It would set a poor precedent for the marriage." A pause, weighted and cool. "Leave us, Huntmaster. I won't ask a third time." Halvard went. The latch dropped behind him like a stone into a pond, and Elira was alone with the man who had claimed her, and she discovered that all the sharp words that had come so easily in a crowded hall had deserted her entirely now that there was no crowd to be brave in front of. "Your Majesty," she made herself say, "I insulted you and 10 better-born men, and I have no excuse but my own temper. You don't need to marry death's leftover to make a point of it. Strip me of my post, send me back to the Reach, and I'll not say another word against the crown as long as I live." Corvain looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the map table, and Elira realized, with a fresh drop of dread, that he was not looking at her at all now. He was looking at the map, at the northern border, at the long broken line of the Reach she had walked 10,000 times, and his scarred finger came down on a valley 3 days' ride north of the keep and rested there. "Tell me about the kettle," he said. She blinked. It was so far from anything she braced for that her mouth answered before her fear could. "It's a dead valley, bad ground. Nothing waters there, and nothing dens there, and the wardens have crossed it off the patrol since before I carried a knife. Nothing dens there," he repeated soft, "and yet 3 of my wardens walked into it last month, on my own quiet order, and none of the 3 walked out." He looked up, and for the first time the flatness in his eyes had something moving under it, something banked and dangerous. "The bodies came back over the wall a week later, torn in a way that no beast in Vilemore tears. And every man who might have tracked what did it is either dead or too frightened to read the sign true, or," the finger lifted from the map and pointed, unhurried, at her, "the best tracker on the northern border, who last night stood up in my hall and told 100 witnesses she does not need anyone's open hand." The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, the gate bell had finally stopped. "You didn't choose me," Elira said slowly, as the shape of it came up out of the dark. "You hired me." In front of the whole court, where no one could ask you why the Iron King wants his finest tracker close enough to keep, and dressed as a bride, so the question never gets asked at all. Something that was almost, but not quite, a smile touched the corner of the king's mouth. And it was somehow the coldest thing he'd done yet. "You're quicker than the men who refused you." "I did notice that before I noticed anything else." He straightened from the table. "Here is what I am offering, Warden, and I will say it once. Be my betrothed in the sight of Valemore, and my tracker in the dark where it isn't watching. Find me what's killing my wardens in a valley where nothing is supposed to live. Do that, and I will make you a free woman with land of your own and gold enough that no man's open hand will ever matter to you again." The banked thing surfaced fully in his eyes now, and it was not warmth. But it was not nothing either. "Refuse me, and you may walk back to the Reach this hour, and I will never trouble you again. I don't take what isn't given." I only ever have to be asked. And if I find what's killing your wardens, Elira said, and it turns out to be someone you'd rather it wasn't someone with a name and a chair at your table? For the first time, the king went entirely still. And the cold that came off him then was a different cold than the one he wore for the court. Then you will bring it to me, anyway, he said very quietly. And you will let me be the one to decide what it costs. That is the whole of what I am buying. Warden, not your sword. Your honesty in a house that has run clean out of it. Elira stood in the cold gray room with a dead man's valley under the king's finger and 11 years of being no one's choice sitting like a stone in her chest, and she understood that she was being offered the first thing anyone in her whole life had ever wanted her for. But because of exactly the thing the mark had made her, a woman death had failed to keep, and who had gone out alone into the dark ever since. "Show me the bodies," she said. The corner of his mouth moved again. "I had a feeling," said the Iron King, "that you'd want to see them first." And he turned for the door and stopped, one hand on the frame, his back to her, and added in a voice gone suddenly, deliberately quiet, "One more thing, Warden. Whatever you find in the kettle, you bring it to me. Not to the huntmaster, not to anyone who wears my colors." He glanced back, and the gray eyes pinned her. "There are only 3 people who knew where I sent those wardens to die. 2 of them are in this keep, and I have not yet proved which. It is a strange thing to be wanted at last, and stranger still, when the wanting comes from a man who has just told you, plainly, that he wants only the use of you." Elira turned the king's offer over the whole of that first day, and could not decide whether she had been rescued or simply bought at a better price than the 10 men had been willing to pay. She settled, in the end, on the only conclusion a warden ever really trusts, that she would learn more by walking the ground than by lying in her bunk guessing at it. He showed her the bodies at dusk, in the cold cellar beneath the keep where the ice was cut and stored, and where 3 of his wardens now lay under waxed cloth going slowly gray. Elira had seen death done by every beast the North kept. She knew the wide, ragged signature of a bear, the neat economy of a lynx, the way a wolf pack opens a thing along its soft lines. She peeled the cloth back from the first man and went very still, because what had been done to him was none of those, and it was pretending to be all of them at once. "Bring the lamp closer," she said, "and forgot entirely to add your majesty." And the king brought the lamp closer himself, rather than call a servant to do it. Which, she noticed and filed away. Here, she turned the dead man's shoulder. Under the torn edges of the wound, where a beast's tooth would have crushed and splintered, the bones showed a single clean face, flat as cut timber. "That's a blade, a heavy one, swung by someone who knew where to put it. He was dead before anything laid a claw on him." She moved the lamp down the body, her voice going flat and certain the way it did when the sign was speaking to her, and the fear had nowhere left to stand, and the tearing came after. "Look how little he bled from it. You don't bleed like that once your heart stopped. Someone killed these men clean, and then spent a long, patient hour making them look like a monster's work, so no warden would ever ride out to ask a man's questions." The silence in the cellar had weight. When she looked up, Corvain was watching her, and the lamp had put a low, warm color into his flat gray eyes that she did not think belonged there naturally. "9 men have looked at these bodies," he said. 7 called it a beast. 2 called it a beast and asked to be reassigned south. A pause. "You are the first to call it a man. The first honest one, maybe." She lowered the cloth with more gentleness than she'd have admitted to. "Or the first who isn't afraid of what saying it out loud might cost. And you are not afraid of that, Your Majesty," Elira said. "I have been the worst thing that could happen to a room since I was 6 years old. There's a freedom in it you'll never know. When you're already the ill luck no one wants standing near them, you stop being able to make it worse." She heard how much truth had leaked into that, and pressed her mouth shut. Too late. Something moved in his face. Not softness. He did not have the equipment for softness. but a kind of arrested attention, as though she'd said a thing in a language he'd been told his whole life that no one else spoke. He looked at her a moment longer than a king needs to look at a tracker. "We ride at first light," he said. "The two of us. My guard comes as far as the valley mouth, and no further." He turned for the cellar stair, and the iron came back down over him like a visor. "I trust the kettle to kill anyone I bring into it. I would rather not hand it help." They rode north through a country going bare and brown with the years turning, and Elira learned, over 2 days of it, that the Iron King on a horse in the wild was a different creature than the Iron King on a dais. He spoke little and missed nothing. He never once complained of the cold or the ground or the long silences, which alone set him above every high-born man she'd ever guided. And once, when her mare put a hoof wrong on scree and lurched, his hand shot out and had the bridle, before Elira had finished reaching for it herself. Fast, sure, and gone again the instant the danger passed, as if touching her had been a task to complete, rather than a thing to want. "You expected me to be soft," he said, on the second night, watching her across a small, mean fire. "It was not a question. I expected you to be cruel," she said. "The songs only sing the cruel parts. The songs are accurate." He fed a stick to the flames. "I broke 6 pack lines to make 1 kingdom. I hanged men I'd hunted beside. I did not do any of it kindly, and I would do all of it again, because the thing that came before me was worse, and no one else had the stomach to end it." The firelight cut his face into hard planes. "I am exactly what they call me, Warden. I only wanted you to know it from my own mouth before you decided how much of me to trust." It was, Elira thought, the strangest kind of honesty. A man laying his ugliness on the table so you could not later accuse him of hiding it. She did not know yet that it was also the most dangerous thing he could have done, because there is nothing on this earth so seductive to a woman who has never been chosen as a man who refuses to lie to her. They reached the kettle at midday of the 3rd, and the guard stopped at its mouth as ordered, and the two of them walked their horses down into a valley where the wind died and the birds went quiet, and even Elira's sure hands went cold on the reins. She had crossed it off the patrol herself, years ago. Nothing waters here, nothing dens here. Which was why, 40 paces in, when she knelt at the lip of a dry runnel and read the ground, her whole body went still, in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Someone's been here," she said quietly. "Recently, not one man, many. With horses that were fed grain, not grass. I can smell the dung. It's wrong for anything wild." Her fingers hovered over a print pressed deep and clean into the frozen mud. "And they came and went by a path through the kettle that every warden in Valemore has been taught for 100 years does not exist." She looked up at her king. "Your dead valley." "Isn't dead, Your Majesty. Somebody's been very careful to make sure we all believed it was. They followed the wrong-footed trail deeper than any sane warden would have, because the king would not turn back, and Elira would not send him on alone. And somewhere in the telling of that decision is the whole shape of everything that came after. The path wound where no path should, along a seam in the valley wall. Soft-footed men had worn smooth, and the deeper they went, the louder Elira's every instinct screamed. She read a cold camp, ash, gone to gray, picket lines for a dozen horses, the greasy leavings of men who had eaten well and left in order rather than in flight. This was no bandit hole. Bandits are hungry and careless and leave their fear all over the ground. These men had been paid and drilled and told to tidy up after themselves. "A supply road," she murmured, half to herself. "That's what this is. Someone's moving men and coin and gods know what through a valley the crown swore was empty, right under the Northern Watch, and they murdered 3 wardens and dressed it as a monster to keep the road a secret." She sat back on her heels. "Your Majesty, whoever's doing this isn't raiding you. They're building something. This is patient. This is..." The first arrow took her hood. She was moving before the sound of it caught up. throwing herself sideways into the king and taking him down behind a shelf of rock as the second shaft cracked off the stone where his head had just been. Then they came out of the seams in the valley wall all at once. 6, 8, rapt-faced and silent, blades already out, and there was no more time for reading sign. Elira had been fighting things bigger than herself, her entire life, and men it turned out were easy after wolves. She caught the first blade on her own, turned it, and drove her elbow hard into the man's throat. She took the second across the ribs and gave him a broken knee for it and did not feel the cut until much later. What she had not expected, what stopped her heart for half a beat in the middle of it, was the king. Corvain did not fight like a man who had people to fight for him. He fought like the thing the songs were actually about. He was economical and enormous, and entirely without mercy, and when a rapt-faced man got inside Elira's guard and raised a blade for her back, the king broke the man's arm and put him down a half-second after, and never once changed expression, as though the fight were simply a chore that had presented itself. Then a whistle cut the valley, sharp, clean, 2 notes, and the men still standing broke off as one and melted back into the rock, not scattering, not panicking. A disciplined retreat, called by someone who valued them enough to keep them alive for the next time. Silence crashed back down. Elira crouched, with her blade up and her ribs on fire, scanning the empty stone, her breath sawing loud in the dead air. "You're bleeding," the king said. "So are you." She hadn't looked away from the rocks. "Your Majesty, that whistle. Those men?" That was a signal from a commander, who's done it 100 times, and they obeyed it like wardens obey the horn. She finally turned to look at him, and what she saw in his face put a cold finger down her spine. "You're not surprised. Someone just put 8 blades and 2 bowmen into a valley to kill you, and you are not surprised." For a moment, he only looked at her, and the banked thing behind his eyes came near enough to the surface that she could almost name it. "The kettle is the 4th attempt this year," he said at last, quietly. "The bodies were bait. I sent wardens to die because I needed to see who would come to finish the job, and I needed a tracker beside me, good enough to read the men when they did." He wiped his blade clean on a dead man's cloak. "I did not think there would be 8 of them. That was poorly done of me. You could have been killed for my arithmetic, and I find that I mind that a great deal more than I expected to." It was the closest thing to an apology. She suspected he had offered another living soul in 9 years, and it landed somewhere under her ribs that had nothing to do with the wound. Later, by a fire, built small and hidden, he cleaned and bound her forearm himself, his hands careful in a way the rest of him was not. "Why did you never hope for it?" he asked without looking up. "The choosing. You stood that line, 3 years running. A woman doesn't do that unless some part of her is still hoping. Because hoping is how death's leftover gets herself hurt," Elira said, and her voice came out rawer than she wanted. "You learn it early, Your Majesty. You learn that wanting a thing is just handing someone the exact shape of the wound they can make in you, so you stop. You go out into the dark alone where nothing can be taken from you, because you've already made sure there's nothing left to take." She stared into the flames. "I don't hope. It's the only thing that's ever kept me whole." He was quiet for a long moment. When he tied off the bandage, his thumb passed once, slow, across the inside of her wrist, and she felt it go all the way up her arm and settle somewhere behind her sternum, warm, in a place she had kept frozen shut on purpose for 11 years. She pulled her arm back too fast. He let her. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire ticked. Somewhere out in the dark, a nightbird tried one note, and thought better of it. She was aware of him, the way you are aware of a cliff edge in the dark, not looking at it, and unable to think about anything else. It was the most dangerous she had felt in years, and not one blade in the kettle had a thing to do with it. And it was only later, rolling the dead men's gear through her hands, out of pure warden's habit, that she found it, a strap of good northern leather, and burned into it, small and sure, the sigil of a running wolf with a broken tooth. She knew that mark. She had been trained under that mark since she was 13 years old. It was the private seal of the master of the hunt. And there was exactly one man in all of Valemore entitled to burn it into leather. Alira closed her hand around the strap so the king would not see and could not, for the life of her, have said why she did it. There is a kind of cold that living in it long enough will teach you to call safety. And the great trouble of Alira's life, the trouble underneath all the other troubles, was that she had spent 11 years mistaking the one for the other. She did not know that yet. She was about to learn it the way people learn the important things, which is to say, too late and all at once. They did not speak of the strap. She told herself she needed to be certain before she said a word that could end a man. And that was true, and she did not look too closely at the other, softer reason, which was that saying it out loud would make it real. And she was not ready for it to be real. They camped the last night a half-day short of the keep, in the lee of a standing stone, and something between them had changed in the valley, and neither pretended otherwise. "You broke 6 pack lines," she said into the dark, "and hanged men you'd hunted with, and you tell me the songs are accurate. But you clean a stranger's arm, like it matters whether it heals straight. Which one's the lie, your majesty? Neither." The fire had burned low, and his voice came out of the half-dark, stripped of its cord iron. "That's the part no one wants, true. A man can be exactly as hard as they say and still—" He stopped. She heard him decide something. "Do you know what it is to be feared by everyone and chosen by no one? They kneel. They obey. Not one of them in 9 years has wanted a single thing about me that wasn't the crown. I made myself into an axe, because an axe was what the kingdom needed, and the trouble with becoming an axe is that no one ever holds one for comfort, a dry, humorless breath. You stood in my hall and told 100 people you needed no one's open hand. I have wanted to say that sentence out loud my entire life, and never once had the nerve. And there it was, the thing she had not been braced for, worse than any blade in the kettle. Not his cruelty, his likeness. The recognition of one starved thing by another across a fire, each of them having survived by swearing off the exact thing they were starving for. She should have kept her eyes on the wall. She had a whole life's practice. She crossed the space between them instead. What followed, she would never afterward be able to lay out in order, only in pieces that glowed, his hand coming up to her jaw as if she might bolt, and then as if she were the only fixed thing in a moving world, the iron gone entirely out of him. And under it, a want so plain and so undefended that it undid her more thoroughly than tenderness ever could have. The low sound he made against her mouth, as if she'd hurt him, as if being wanted was a wound he'd forgotten how to take. She had been desired for her blade before. She had never once in her life stood inside the plain, helpless pull of a man who wanted her, the frost-marked woman death had left in the snow, and it broke something open in her that she had spent a decade sealing shut. And then, at the height of it, with her face pressed to the drum of his heart and his arms locked around her, like she was the last warm thing in the world, the frost thawed. That was the only way she could ever name it. A warmth that was not hers came pouring in through the place where they touched, distinct and foreign and utterly clear. His want, his relief, and under both of them, a terror as old and deep as her own. She could feel him, his heart's weather, running straight into hers, along a thread that had not existed an hour before, a bond, a true one. The thing the frost-marked were never, ever supposed to be able to make, because debts left over cannot be kept by life. Everyone had told her so. The old wives and the fostering families and 11 years of empty choosings. And here it was anyway, alive and thrumming, and it did not fill her with joy. It filled her with pure animal terror. Because a bond was not safety, a bond was the whole shape of the wound. Handed over, gift-wrapped. A bond was every frozen door in her thrown open at once, with no way left to shut them. And she had learned before she'd learned to read that the open door is where the cold gets in and takes everything you have. She pulled back with a gasp, her hand pressed flat to her own sternum as if she could push the warmth back out. Elira. His eyes were dark and for once utterly unguarded. It was nothing. She heard the words leave her like something thrown. The cold. The fight. It's nothing, Your Majesty. He went very still. She watched the unguarded thing in his face flinch and fold, watched the iron come sliding back down over him, colder now for having been lifted. Nothing, he repeated, quiet and careful, in the flat court voice she had not heard him use since the cellar. You're right. He turned and fed the fire, a stick it did not need. Get some sleep, Warden. We reached the keep by noon. She lay awake the whole night, with the thread still humming under her ribs no matter how hard she willed it dead. And somewhere in the smallest hour, a cold thought surfaced that she could not push back down. He had chosen her in that hall so fast. So, sure. Before she'd said a clever word or read a single body. As though he had walked into the choosing already knowing exactly which frost-marked warden he meant to take home. As though she had been picked long before she ever opened her mouth. She turned onto her side, away from the low red coals, and tried to make the thought behave. It would not. Met. It only sat there in the dark, patient and cold, the way the best trails always did, the ones that did not want to be followed, the ones that led somewhere you would rather not go. She was a tracker. She had spent her whole life learning that you do not get to choose where the sign takes you. You only get to decide whether you are honest enough to follow it. And every instinct she owned was telling her, quietly and without mercy, that this trail did not end anywhere she wanted to stand. She was still turning that over at dawn, sick and sleepless, when she rose to saddle the horses and saw the king already awake at the standing stone. And in his hands, unfolded a paper she recognized as coming from his own steward's satchel. She came up quiet, the way the Reach had taught her, close enough to see over his shoulder before he knew she was there. It was a list. 3 names. In the steward's neat hand, the king's own name. And, circled once in hard black ink, Halvard, master of the hunt. There is a particular cruelty in learning that the warmest thing that ever happened to you was, at least in the beginning, a piece of arithmetic. Elira stood at the standing stone in the gray dawn, with her mentor's name circled in black ink, not a hand's breadth from her face, and she felt the frost she'd let thaw over 3 days in the king's company come slamming back down over everything at once. Corvain did not startle. He simply folded the paper, unhurried, and turned to face her, and she watched him decide. She could feel it come down the bond like weather to give her the truth, instead of the smooth thing. Yes. You think the Huntmaster is your traitor. The man who runs your entire northern watch. I have thought so for 6 months. He said it evenly. Someone has been bleeding coin and men and grain out of the crown and into a road through a dead valley, restoring the packlines I broke, and selling my death to the Sunmark for the privilege. Someone the wardens obey, without question. Someone who could send 3 men to die in the kettle and have it filed as a beast. There are precisely 3 people in Valemore, with the reach to do all of that. I am one. My steward is the second. He let it sit. You have tracked beside the third for 11 years. No. The word came out of her before thought, not Halvard. You don't. He pulled me out of a snowbank when the whole keep had decided I was a spare mouth. He put the first knife in my hand. He is the one thing in my entire life that was never, not once, a lie. I know what he is to you. And here his voice changed. And the thing underneath it was the thing she had been dreading since the cold thought first surfaced in the dark. It is why you are standing here. The valley went silent around her. Say it plainly, she said, whatever it is. Say it plainly, Your Majesty. because I think I have already worked it out and I would like to be wrong. He did not look away, which she would grant him, later. When she could grant him anything at all, I could not move on Halvard. Arrest the beloved master of the hunt on a king's suspicion, and every warden in the north takes it as the usurper, devouring one of their own. And then I have the revolt he's been building handed to me a year early, with the sun mark at my back door. I needed proof no man alive could argue with, and I needed it, carried to me by someone Halvard trusted absolutely. A pause. There is exactly one person Halvard has ever loved, like his own blood. The frost-marked girl he raised. The one soul in Valemore who could stand at his shoulder and read his sign, and never once be suspected of it. So you came to the choosing, Alira said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very flat. The reading voice, the one that does not shake because it has stopped being able to afford to. You came down off that dais and put your open hand between us in front of the whole court. And I thought, gods. I thank the dark for it. I thought that for once in my life, someone had looked at death's leftover and wanted what he saw. The laugh that came out of her had no bottom to it. And you'd already chosen, before I said a single clever word. You chose me, because I was the shortest road to the man who raised me. Alira, don't. She stepped back, and he stopped at once, and she hated that too. Hated that he'd learned already exactly how close he was allowed to stand. Was that it? All of it? The fire? The bond? Was I the sword you needed sharp and pointed at Halvard's back, and you let me believe, not all of it? He said it low and rough, and down the open thread she could feel that it was true, which was somehow the worst thing that had ever happened to her, because she could no longer trust even the truth. I won't pretend I didn't choose you to reach him. But it stopped being that. It stopped being that in the kettle, when you put your body over mine without deciding to. And I have never in my life. You want to know how I know you're lying about Halvard? She said over him, because if he finished that sentence, she would break. And she would not break here. A traitor keeps her head down and her hands clean. She does not stand up in a king's own hall and tell him to his face that the crown hasn't the stomach to come down off its dais. She saw the flinch go through him and knew she'd landed it. Knew that was the very reasoning that had cleared her in his eyes. And she turned it around and drove it back through his own chest. That's how you knew I wasn't Halvard's creature, isn't it? Because I insulted you in front of 100 people. Well, Your Majesty, the man who taught me to say the true thing out loud, no matter who it cost, was Halvard. Every grievance I threw at your throne, he put in my mouth first. So if the fearless honest woman was proof of anything, it was proof of him. She was crying and she didn't care, and she reached past all of it to the oldest wound, the one under the wound, and said the thing that had been true since she was 6 years old. I let myself believe I was wanted. For one stupid night, I let myself. And now I get to know exactly what wanting me was for, Alira. He took a step and stopped himself. And she watched the most powerful man in Valemore stand there with nothing at all in his hands. For 9 years, I made certain no one could ever use a single thing I felt against me. Then I watched you go over a rock wall to take a blade meant for my back, and I felt something I had no defense against, and I did the coward's thing. I let you keep the smaller story because the larger one frightened me. That is the truth. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you not to stand there and call it a lie, because the lie is the one thing it never was. That's the whole trouble with you, she said without turning around. You only ever tell me the truth once it's already too late to be worth anything. She turned and walked out of the kettle mouth, past his 2 silent guards, and she did not look back. And behind her, the Iron King said her name once quietly, into a valley where nothing was supposed to live, and let her go. Halvard was waiting for her at the top of the north road, sitting his horse against the gray morning, like a man who had known exactly which way she'd come, which she would only understand the meaning of much later. There she is, he said, and his weathered face creased into the relief of a man whose child had come home safe. And every starved and grieving part of her wanted to fall into it. I've had riders out since dawn. When they said the king took you into the kettle alone, I thought. He stopped. He looked at her ruined face. His own went gentle. What did he do to you? And because it hurt too much to hold, and because he was the one safe thing left in the world, she told him that it had been a lie from the start. That the Iron King had chosen death's leftover in that hall for the use of her and nothing else, and let her believe otherwise, and used her the way everyone had always. She couldn't finish it. Halvard's face did something complicated. I know, he said softly. I hoped to spare you learning it. I'm sorry, Elira. Truly. He swung down off his horse and put his big hands on her shoulders, the way he had when she was 13, and shaking in a snowbank. And she let him, because the body remembers who kept it alive. But you have to hear the rest of it now. And it's worse than a broken heart. That man is not what the crown pretends. 3 nights passed. While he had you deep in the north for his cover, he turned off the reach and rode east, in the dark, and put a Sunmark trading party to the blade. Men, women, the Margrave's own cousin among them, to wreck a treaty he never meant to sign, and dressed it as a beast same as the kettle. I read the sign myself at first light. Fresh, 3 days old, on the eastern Sunmark Road. His jaw set. He's been the monster all along, girl. And the Margrave of the Sunmark is sitting in Ashmark this very morning. Mourning kin he doesn't yet know are dead. And here's the thing about a good lie. It is built to fit the shape of your grief, so exactly that you never think to hold it up against the ground. But Elira was a tracker before she was anyone's broken heart, and the ground was the one thing that had never once lied to her, and Halvard's story did not fit it. 3 nights passed on the eastern Sunmark Road. But 3 nights passed, she had been at the very bottom of the kettle. 3 days' hard ride, due north, throwing the king out of the path of a crossbow bolt. A bolt loosed by masked men who wore Halvard's own running wolf sigil burned into their gear. Corvain could not have been east butchering a trading party 3 nights ago, because 3 nights ago Corvain had been north, leading into the snow beside her with a dozen of his own guard at the valley mouth, to swear to every hour of it. The sign Halvard swore he'd read on the eastern road did not exist, because the man he pinned it on had been a week's ride from that road at the bottom of a valley the huntmaster himself had sworn was empty, which meant Halvard was lying. To her face in the gentle voice, he'd used to teach her the difference between a lynx and a wolf. She felt the whole thing assemble itself in one cold, silent rush, the way a track resolves out of scuffed ground once you finally have the light on it. Right, the strap in the kettle burned with his running wolf sigil. The ambushers who'd broken off at a tone-note whistle like wardens answering the horn. His name circled in the king's own hand, and now a setting here, lie-shaped precisely to put the crown's death in her innocent mouth. The man who had pulled her out of the snow was the man selling the north to the Sunmark, and he had come up the road at dawn, not to save her, but because a heartbroken woman who'd just learned her king had used her was the sharpest possible blade, and he meant to use her exactly as he'd accused the king of doing. Every instinct she owned reached for her knife. Not yet. One woman against the master of the hunt, who commanded every soldier in the keep. Not yet. What do we do? She asked, and made her voice crumple, made her face fold into the grief that was God's help her, entirely real and only pointed the wrong way. It was the finest piece of tracking she would ever do, laying a false trail across her own face for the man who'd taught her the craft. Halvard's eyes sharpened with something that was almost tenderness and almost hunger. We go to the Margrave, before Corvain can put his own gloss on it. A king who'd butcher and invoice blood is a king no realm will stand behind. He'll fall, and there are better and truer houses ready to steady Vilemore when he does. His hand tightened on her shoulder. But it cannot come from me. I'm his huntmaster. They'll say I grasped for power. It has to come from someone no one could doubt. His voice went soft as snowfall. It has to come from you, Elira, the king's own chosen bride. If you tell the Margrave you found the sign of Corvain's crime, not one soul in that hall will question a word of it. She let him lead her down through the waking keep, and it was the longest walk of her life. Because she had to carry a lie into a room full of the most dangerous people in 2 realms, and turn it inside out with nothing in her hands but the truth, and 11 years of the very training the traitor beside her had given her. One wrong word, and the north broke. One wrong word, and the Sunmark had its war. The Margrave of the Sunmark had taken the council hall in the East Tower. Corvain was already there. He looked up when she came in behind Halvard, and for half a breath, his whole ruined face opened toward her like a door. Then he saw whose shoulder her hand rested on, and understood what it must mean, and the door closed, and the light in him went out. Halvard bowed low. "Your Grace," he said to the Margrave, "it grieves me past speaking to bring you this, but the king at your right hand has wronged your blood." He laid it all out, the murdered trading party, the envoy's cousin, the beast sign that was no beast, and then he turned, and the whole room turned with him, to the silent frost-marked woman by the door. "Ask her," Halvard said gently, and held out his open hand toward her. The same gesture 10 men had refused her, and 1 king had not. She loves the king. She has every reason on earth to shield him. Ask her what she found, and know that whatever she says against the man she was to marry, she says it because it is true. He smiled at her, sure of her, proud of her, the way he had been since she was 13. "Elira, tell the Margrave what you saw." Every face in the hall swung to her at once. The Margrave leaning forward with a father's dread already in his eyes. The Sunmark guards with their hands drifting toward their hilts, Halvard sure of her as sunrise, and Corvain who had gone perfectly still. Watching the woman he'd broken walk in on the arm of his enemy, and plainly believing she had come to bury him, she looked at her king. "I'm sorry," she told him, with no words at all. "I should have believed you in the valley. I'm going to spend a long time being sorry." Then she turned to the Margrave of the Sunmark and said, in the clear, flat, carrying voice she'd once used to insult a throne, "I saw nothing of the sort, because it never happened. The master of the hunt is lying to you, your grace, and I can prove it standing here." The hall snapped tight as a drawn bow. Beside her, Halvard went rigid. "He tells you the king turned east 3 nights past, and killed your kin on the Sunmark Road, and that he read the sign this morning, fresh, 3 days old." She did not let herself look at Halvard. She kept her eyes on the Margrave, because the ground was on her side and the ground does not need to look anyone in the eye. 3 nights past, King Corvain was 3 days' hard ride due north of here, at the bottom of the valley they call the Kettle, with a dozen of his own guard at the mouth of it who will swear to every hour. "I know the hour better than any of them, your grace, because it was the hour masked men tried to put a crossbow bolt through him, and I pulled him out of its path with my own 2 hands. He was bleeding into the northern snow 3 nights past. He was not on your eastern road. He could not have come within a week's ride of it. The sign the huntmaster swears he found cannot exist, because the man he pins it on was never anywhere it could have been made. This is grief," Halvard said, and his voice had gone from snowfall to iron. "The girl is distraught. He used her. She'll say anything. Then a search costs you nothing." Elira rounded on the hall, her chin coming up. "There's a road through the Kettle Valley that every warden was taught does not exist. A road for moving coin and men and Sunmark steel to the broken pack lines. The men who ambushed the king in that valley 3 nights past carried leather burned with the master of the hunt's own sigil. Search his quarters now, while he stands here and can't reach them. See whether you find the proof of a murdered trading party, or a paymaster's ledger, and a running wolf seal that could brand every strap on that dead road." She let the last of it fall into the silence. "One of us is lying to you, your grace. Only one of us is asking you to look." The Margrave of the Sunmark looked from the frost-marked woman to the calm gray king to the huntmaster, and said, very quietly, "A search costs nothing," and nodded to his guards. And Halvard's face changed. The grave, honest mentor she had loved for 11 years went out of it like a lamp pinched dead, and what was left underneath was cornered and cold, and had a knife in its sleeve. He came at her, not at the king, at her, the blade sliding free, half a beat before he reached her, and somewhere across the hall she heard Corvain say her name, raw with a terror she would think about for the rest of her life. But this was the one thing in all the world she knew how to do, and the man coming at her had with his own hands taught her how to do it. She turned into him, instead of away. She caught the knife arm at the wrist, felt the old familiar architecture of a body she'd sparred 1,000 times, and used every pound of his own weight to put the master of the hunt face down on the council hall stone. Her knee dropped between his shoulders, his blade skittered away across the floor. She leaned down close to his ear, close enough that only he could hear it. "You pulled me out of the snow," she said, and her voice did not shake. "And you made me the best tracker in the north. And then you forgot the one thing you should have remembered." She pressed him flat. "You made me. You never once should have let it come down to which of us was better on the ground." Then the Sunmark guards had him, and hauled him up, and dragged him out, and it was done. They searched his quarters within the hour, and found the ledger and the seal, and a letter to the Sunmark court not yet sent, and the accusation against the crown collapsed into what it had always been. There was more besides, a map of the Kettle Road in Halvard's own careful hand, and a tally of coin that matched to the copper, the grain and the spears, and the lamp oil that had never once reached the barracks she'd stood a chair on and defended. The patient bookkeeping of a man who had spent years bleeding the north he'd sworn to guard, and telling himself the whole time that it was loyalty to an older and truer crown. The Margrave, ashen, went to see the kin he'd been told were dead and found them alive, and never touched. The old pack lines, rising, died in its cradle. The advisors scattered into the corridors in tight, murmuring knots. And then, in the emptying hall, it was only the two of them. Corvain hadn't moved. He was looking at her as though he'd never seen her before. "You saved my kingdom," he said. "After what I did to you, you walked into that room, and you still—" "I walked into that room to stop a traitor," Alira said. And her voice came out, flat and level and closed. "Because it was true, and because Halvard sold the north. Whatever else, I am a warden of the Reach. Not 1 second of it was forgiveness." The thread between them was still there. She could feel it, the thaw, the pull, his relief and his grief and his want, all pouring toward her along it. And she held her own side shut with everything she had. "The bond is real," he said. "It doesn't lie, even when I did. It doesn't matter if it's real." She was already stepping back. "You looked me in the eye for 3 days, and let me believe I'd finally been chosen for me. A bond doesn't undo that. It just means I get to feel exactly how much I've lost, every hour, for the rest of my life." She saw the words land, saw the hope go out of his face, the way the honesty had gone out of Halvard's, and she made herself finish it. "I'm glad you're alive. You'll be a good king. You already are, God's help me." A breath. "But I don't trust you. And I don't know if I ever will again." She turned and walked out of the hall, and behind her the Iron King, who had never in 9 years asked a living soul for anything, said, "Alira." Please to her back, and she kept walking, because she had learned the lesson of her whole life twice over now. And the lesson was that the open door is where the cold gets in. She was master of the hunt before the first snow. The post Halvard had bled the north to keep, handed to the frost-marked girl he'd pulled out of a snowbank, which was either the gods' idea of justice or their idea of a joke. And Alira had stopped being sure there was a difference. She was good at it. She had always known she would be. She cut the rot out of the wardens, root and branch, reopened the kettle road under the crown's own banner, and the North, which had spent 9 years braced for the Iron King's fist, began instead to trust the one thing it had never had from him: a hand on the border it could believe in. The city started, cautiously, to love him for it, and the king, who had done all of that, spent the whole of that long winter doing the one thing the songs swore he could not. He asked, not with flowers. He had no gift for flowers, and they both knew it, and he did not insult her by pretending otherwise. The Iron King courted the way iron does everything, plainly, coldly, and without any hope of being anything other than what it was. He left his side of the bond open. That was the thing that nearly killed her. He could have shut it, spared them both, and instead he left it open every hour of every day, so that she, who kept her own side sealed like a frozen gate, felt him anyway. Felt the gray grind of his mornings and the particular quiet of his want, and, worst of all, felt that he never once used it to press her. He simply let her know without a single word that the door on his end was open, and that it would stay open, and that she could walk through it or not, and that either way, he would not lie to her about the cold coming in. He gave her true things. A letter came most weeks, in his own hard hand, and not one of them was a love poem. Here is a thing I have never told anyone. They began, more or less, and then he would tell her about the brother he'd failed to save from the old Alpha's purge, about the first man he'd hanged and how he'd been sick after and told no one, about the exact and unheroic fear he'd felt every morning of 9 years, on a throne he'd taken with his own hands. You told me a bond is the whole shape of the wound handed over. One of them ended. You were right, so here is mine, one piece at a time. For as long as you'll let me hand it to you, you may do with it whatever you like. She told herself she kept them as evidence of something, and did not examine what. The letters were not the worst of it, or the best, she could never decide which. The worst of it was the smallness of the things he began to notice. That she took her cocoa scalding and unsweetened. That she stood her watches on the east wall by preference, because the east wall caught the first gray light. That she had never once in her life been given a name-day gift by a single soul, because death's leftover did not get faded, and so on the morning of hers, she found no ribbon and no cake, but a new tracking knife left square in the center of the map table, balanced and plain and perfect, with no note at all. There was no note, because a note would have asked her for something, and he had sworn to ask her for nothing. She carried that knife every day after. She told herself it was simply a good knife. It was a good knife. That was not why she carried it. Senna had opinions. As Senna had opinions about weather and boots and the moral failings of men who chewed loudly. Good, she said. In the early weeks, let the Iron King freeze a while. You don't owe that man the time of day. But by the deep of winter the line had moved, the way lines do. He gave you Halvard's own post, she said one night, not looking up from her mending. He could have buried what you did to save him and taken the credit and made you a footnote. He made you the most powerful warden in Vielmore instead. And then he stood back and asked for nothing. A pause. 40 letters, Tobin says. 43, said Tobin, who apparently counted. I was used, Elira said. I'm not lining up to be used again. Were you, though, said Senna, or were you chosen badly? By a man who didn't know how to do it any other way. And are you calling it the first thing, because the second one's the one that scares you? Elira did not have an answer for that, which was itself a kind of answer, and she went out into the dark of the Reach that night, the way she'd gone out into it her whole life. To be somewhere, nothing could be taken from her. And for the first time in 11 years, the old cold comfort didn't come. She stood alone on a ridge under a hard scatter of stars, with the wind cutting through her, and the bond a low, warm ache under her ribs that would not die, however hard she starved it. And she understood, all at once and far too late as usual, what she had become. She had spent her whole life certain that wanting was how death's leftover got herself destroyed. And she had been right about everything except the size of it. Because here was the truth, the ridge finally made her hold up against the ground. She was doing to Corvain exactly what the 10 men had done to her. She was standing in a warm hall, with an open hand held out to her, and she was passing it over, because a woman with a pale eye frightened her, and the woman with the pale eye was herself. She'd called 10 men cowards for refusing the risk of her, and she was refusing the far greater risk of being, at last, wanted back. I am not a coward, she thought, furious, into the wind. And the wind, unhelpfully, did not argue. It was the kind of silence that agrees with you. The next choosing came with the spring thaw, as it does, and the great hall of Ashmark filled again, and the unbonded stood along the western wall in their good clothes, and Alira came not as a girl in the line, but as master of the hunt in grey, to stand her office at the edge of the right. She had not decided anything, she wanted that understood. Then and ever after, she had decided nothing at all, and then the Iron King came down off his dais. He did it the way he'd done it a year before, unhurried, while every wolf in the hall dropped its eyes. But this time, he did not walk the line of the unbonded. He walked to the center of the hall, to the cold flags where the passed over were made to stand in their shame, and he turned to face his own court, and he did the one thing no one in 9 years had ever seen the Iron King do. He put himself in the line. "You all watched me choose a year ago," he said, and his voice carried to the smoke-lost rafters. "It's only right you watch me be refused." He turned, and found her at the hall's edge, and held out his open hand across the whole length of that terrible room, the same gesture 10 men had denied her on this same floor. "Elira, master of the hunt, I chose you once for the use of you, and I have been paying for that hour every day since, and I would pay for it every day I have left." The hand did not waver. "I am asking now for none of it. Not your sword, not your service, not your forgiveness, before it's earned. Only whether you'll have me. And I have told the right, and I tell this hall, that if you refuse me it stands, the crown, bound by its own law, and I will never trouble you again." A breath, and the last of the iron went out of him in front of the entire court. I have never in my life been afraid of dying, but I have been very, very afraid, this whole long winter, of living the rest of it without you. So, refuse me if you like. The throne has finally come all the way down off its dais. It's standing in the market, and it will only ever have to be asked. The hall did not breathe. Somewhere, a bench creaked. And Elira, master of the hunt, death's leftover, the woman 10 men would not warm and a kingdom had learned to fear, looked at the open hand of the king, who had let her feel every hour of his cold rather than lie to her about it, and reached at last for her own frozen door, and threw it wide, and let the warmth come flooding in through the place where they touched. His shock and his hope and his disbelieving joy pouring down the bond so hard it staggered her. For a moment she could not tell whose feeling was whose, and that was the thing no one had ever told her about a bond thrown wide, that it did not make you weak, the way she'd spent her whole life believing it must. It made you too. It meant that the next time death came down, off the mountain for the child it had left breathing in the snow, it would have to come through him to reach her, and through her to reach him. And neither of them, she understood now with a clarity that stopped her breath, had the least intention in the world of letting it. "Ask me again," she said. Across the silent hall, when we're alone, when there's no court to be brave in front of. Her own voice shook for the first time in years, and she let it. "And I'll say yes. I'll say it so you can actually hear it." The corner of the Iron King's mouth moved. That cold near smile she had once thought was the hardest thing about him, and now knew for the most defended thing, and for the first time in the sight of his entire court, it went all the way to his eyes. In the end it took him until midsummer because she made him ask sober and clear-eyed and with no hall to hide the size of it, and he asked her on the east wall, with the cocoa going cold, and across the war table until Senna threatened to resign in writing, and once so plainly and so quietly in the dark that she stopped, pretending she needed asking twice. The whole city came out for it. The boy king no one had taken seriously, who'd made himself into an axe, and then against every song ever sung about him, laid it down, and the frost-marked warden 10 men wouldn't touch, who had turned out to be the one thing death left behind, precisely because it could not bear to keep her. He was not a man built for weeping, and he wept anyway during the vows, and she'd known he would. She very nearly didn't, and the bond gave her away regardless, pouring her over into him until he laughed at her through his own tears, and she stopped caring who saw. 9 years I chose no one, he murmured, when it was done, and then, only you. There's no taking it back now, you understand. Why would I take it back? Said Elira, who had once told the hall full of cowards she needed no one's open hand. When I'm the one who dared the throne to come down and be refused, she had, in the end, gotten every man in that first hall exactly as wrong as they'd gotten her. But that is a different story. Best decision you ever made, Your Majesty. The only one that ever mattered, said the Iron King, and for once she didn't argue.